They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but Veronica knew that in the cutthroat world of high-stakes business, revenge is best served with a hostile takeover and a side of rising stock prices. The boardroom smelled like it always did, of old leather, stale coffee, and unearned confidence, a suffocating mixture that had defined Veronica's professional life for a decade. She sat in the corner, the good daughter, dutifully tapping notes into her tablet, while the men, her father, Richard, and her brothers, Thomas and James, played business, their voices booming with the arrogance of those who had never truly had to fight for anything. Thomas stood at the head of the table, his bespoke suit catching the morning light as he bragged about a merger with Wilson Tech that Veronica knew was doomed to fail, a deal built on vanity rather than value. Her father, Richard, didn't even look at her, his gaze fixed on the quarterly projections until a primal need arose. "Veronica," he said, his voice a casual command that erased her title as Vice President of Strategic Operations, "get Thomas his coffee and bring those biscotti he likes." It was 9:58 a.m., 2 minutes to market open, and the insult landed with the familiar weight of 10 years of dismissal. But today, the weight didn't crush her. It fueled her. Veronica checked her watch, the second hand sweeping toward the hour, and stopped being the daughter. She became the shark. "Actually," she said, her voice soft but cutting through the droning conversation like a razor. "Coffee can wait. We have a new agenda." When Thomas laughed, a sound of genuine amusement at her audacity, she didn't flinch. She just reached into her bag, the one they mocked as a knockoff, and pulled out a folder thick enough to crush a man's ego, placing it on the mahogany table with a heavy thud that silenced the room. "Stock certificates," she announced, her eyes locking with her father's. "Transfer documents, dating back 5 years." While her brothers had been playing golf and slapping backs at the country club, Veronica had been building an empire in the Asian markets they had dismissed as irrelevant. She had bought shares through shell companies, acquiring a little here, a little there, capitalizing on their negligence. "As of this morning," she told them, her voice steady and terrifyingly calm, "I own 52% of this company. I am the majority shareholder." The silence that followed was louder than any shout, a vacuum where their power used to be. The blood drained from her father's face as the realization hit him. His little girl had outmaneuvered him, using the very invisibility he had forced upon her as a weapon. She walked to the doors and threw them open, and her new board walked in. Tech geniuses, innovators, a diverse coalition of the future that stood in stark contrast to the pale, stale old boys club seated at the table. "This is a coup," Thomas sputtered, his face ashen. "No," Veronica corrected, glancing at the wall screen where the stock ticker was already climbing 28% on the news of her takeover. "This is a rescue mission." She handed her father a press release, a single sheet of paper that sealed his fate. It was his retirement announcement. "You have 10 minutes until the press conference," she said, her tone devoid of malice but filled with finality. "You can stand beside me, or you can read about it in the Wall Street Journal." As she walked out to face the cameras, the click of her heels echoing like gunshots in the stunned room, she paused at the door, looking back at her brother one last time. "Oh, and Thomas, the new cafeteria serves better coffee. You should try it, assuming you still have dining privileges." The boardroom of Richardson & Sons was a mausoleum of male ego, a place where the air was always thin and the mahogany was always polished to a mirror shine that reflected the smug faces of men who thought birthright was a skill. In the corner, Veronica Sterling sat like a piece of office furniture, her platinum blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the architectural sharpness of her glasses, tapping away on a tablet that held the lethal injection for their careers, though they just assumed she was taking meeting minutes. When her father, Richard, finally acknowledged her existence, it wasn't to ask for her strategic input on the failing merger, but to sigh, "Emily? Sorry, Veronica, get Thomas his coffee and make sure it's the Colombian blend," a command that hung in the air like a stale insult, dismissing her decade of grueling work in the Asian markets as a hobby while her brothers played golf. But today, the clock struck 9:58 a.m., and the obedient daughter died right there in the leather chair. Veronica stood up, the silence of the room shattering as she said softly but with the weight of an executioner's axe, "Actually, coffee can wait because the agenda has changed." The confusion on Thomas's face was almost pitiful as she walked to the head of the table, placing her Hermes bag, the one they laughed at, on the wood with a heavy thud, pulling out not a notepad but a thick dossier of stock certificates that proved while they were congratulating themselves on mediocrity, she had been systematically buying every available share through shell companies in Seoul and Shanghai. "As of this morning," she announced, watching the blood drain from her father's face, "I don't just work here. I own 52% of Richardson & Sons, which means I am the company, and I am calling this meeting to order." Before they could sputter their protests about bylaws and lawyers, the doors swung open to reveal her new executive board, young, hungry, and brilliant minds she'd poached from the very tech giants her family had ignored. And as the stock ticker on the wall suddenly jumped 28% on the news of her takeover, Veronica slid a single sheet of paper across the table to her father. His retirement press release. "You have 10 minutes to memorize this before the cameras roll," she told them, her voice devoid of the warmth they had exploited for years. And as she turned to leave the room that was finally, truly hers, she paused at the threshold, looking back at her brother who was still trembling in his bespoke suit, and delivered the final blow. "Oh, and Thomas? The new cafeteria serves a superior roast. I suggest you get your own cup, assuming you still have building access by noon."